And so the CBRT model, or the Crawford bias reduction theory and training, really tries to simply classify this work. So first, it requires awareness. You can't do any individual work if you don't even know what you're doing, right? It's the awareness of racism, prejudice, and bias as a social phenomenon. We all know that race is a biological myth, but it is a social reality. It's the awareness of how it shows up for me as an individual, what triggers my bias, prejudice, and racism, and how I cope, because, I'm out here trying to be a good person. And so how do I cope with facing the reality that I am infected with this socially transmitted disease? The next is the investigation of not just understanding what it looks like within me, but how does it manifest in the world individually, interpersonally, and institutionally? And lastly, the goal of reducing, which requires us to authentically, value-driven, not emotion-driven, mindfully, and engage in a strategic, sustainable action. But none of that is possible if this work is driven by our fears and our concerns about those resources, right? And so all of this work can be amazing, and you can read all the great books, and you can understand and be able to point it out and say, oh, misogynoir, I know that. Oh, sexism, I know that. Oh, transphobia, I understand that. You can point, name, identify. But if the behavioral change, if the behaviors are not driven by values, but they're driven by fears, you will still have racism, prejudice, and bias. You'll just be a lot better at identifying it. So that's the CBRT approach. I'll turn it over to you, Kirby, and let me know when to click the next slide.
Thank you, Dana. You can go ahead to the next slide. So I so appreciate Dana's approach to this work. It's probably one of the reasons why we've connected so well, is starting with that awareness. For me, that means really sitting with who I am, where I come from, and what like my life and day looks like every day, right? So I would say that this is not something that has always been conscious for me in terms of, the body that I move in and how that impacts my experience. There was an ignorance for a lot of my life around like why that mattered. But the reality is I'm a white woman. I am also a cisgender heteronormative woman. Typically I am able-bodied, although more recently I have a shoulder injury that is making me appreciate, what it means to be able-bodied more than how I feel right now. But the reality is these impact how I approach this work, how I view this work, and who I am. So to not start with that, not have awareness about oneself is potentially problematic. So for me, I really like to sit with and think about like, who am I and why does that matter to this conversation? Because it matters in really important ways. You can go to the next slide. So this, for me, when I think about this work, a lot of this is about unlearning things that I had previously learned and learning new things, right? So I, maybe like many other white folks, have been socialized to think a lot of different things in my life and have been educated to think various things about myself and about other people. But a lot of my journey here is about telling the truth to myself, to those in my life, to the structures and systems that I interact with, and recognizing that that's hard to do, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, right? So this has been an ongoing journey that involves a lot of truth-telling and a lot of hard conversations, but ones that are necessary to have. You can go to the next slide. This is one I love, and it just so happens to be the person that we're on the call with who said that I share this quote often in my presentations, because when Dana first shared this, an STD, I was thinking, oh, where are we going with this STD? Oh, whoa, that makes so much sense, right? Of course, I didn't think of socially transmitted disease. I went right to another kind of STD. But when Dana and I first had this conversation now over a year and a half ago or so, I think, Dana, it's been a while. This really resonated because I thought, wow, this is something that is transmitted and transferred through people and relationships, which then makes it that much more important for me to think about how I interact and the relationships I have and how I interrupt the transmission of this socially transmitted disease. So this is one that I often think about, and I often share with people that I'm talking to because it's really resonated with me. And it also relates to, go ahead, Danny, you can go to the next slide. This next slide that, again, I would say is not something that's always been a part of my lexicon, right? For much of my life and probably still now, there are a lot of blind spots and have been areas where I have not been aware of my connection to power and what that means. So for me, I have to think about what is white supremacy? What is white exceptionalism? What does that even mean? And really unpacking this idea that, I and many folks have been socialized to believe that there are different degrees of entitlement or power that come with your identity. So this is part of what I have to sort of struggle with and think about if I'm going to engage authentically, right, in hard conversations like the ones that, you know, we're having today. Because unless I can do that, and unless I can think authentically about my own history and my own identity, I'm not showing up as authentically as I need to, right? So like Dana said before, it's not just about changing your ideas, but then your behaviors, sort of walking the walk and not just talking the talk. And that's part of, for me, how I have to think about the world. So I asked myself this. You can go to the next slide, Dana. And I'll ask you to ask yourself this. You don't have to answer, but I asked myself, am I a racist? What does that mean? What does it even feel like to say that out loud? You know, the more I ask myself, the less defensive I feel myself get when I want to say, like, no, I swear I'm not, no, right? That thing that comes up in your throat when you sort of have to sit with some ugly truths about yourself. But I think about this, and I ask myself to reflect on that and consider, in what ways have I performed racism? In what ways have I been someone that has hurt somebody else through my proximity to power or my own sort of behaviors that I've done in relationships? So these are, again, hard questions that I ask myself and the people that I interact with, because I think until we get okay talking about hard stuff, we're not going to be as authentic as we need to be in these spaces. And this, Dana, you can go to the next quote. This is also one of Dana's, so shout out to her as well. Like this, you know, this is the follow-up to that previous slide. Like, you know, Dana had said this to me in one of our earlier conversations, like, yeah, you know, I know some really nice racists. And I'm thinking, yeah, so do I, right? And in fact, I've probably been one of them at some point in my life. And that's something that I need to sit with and think about and unpack and explore, because the reality is I don't want to just be someone that thinks about this stuff, but I need to have it show up in my life in authentic ways. And I can only do that if I'm willing to sit with the hard stuff about myself, about the people I care about my own history. So when I think about approaching this work, it's really about reflecting and about being honest, even when it's really hard or uncomfortable to do so, because to me, that's where authentic change can come from. That's where real change can come from, when we sort of really dig into the parts of ourselves that maybe we like to not always look at because they're hard to look at. But I think sometimes that's where we have to go. So that's just a sort of orienting in terms of how I come to this conversation today.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kirby. Your quotes that you used, first of all, thank you for quoting me. That's lovely. And when I saw that, I was like, oh. Yeah, you know, so many of your quotes, I could have a whole conversation about just those quotes. But I want us to open it up to the quotes we selected. And we also, just FYI, we will have time for Q&A. So if you all have questions, please put them in the chat, or Elijah will let you know if it's not in the chat, if it's in the Q&A. That's one area of Zoom I still haven't mastered after all these months that we've been doing it. Where did the questions go? So I will start with my first question, rather a quote. And this quote specifically for me is a really important one because it guides a lot of the work that I do, and it has to do with responsibility. The other reason that I picked this quote is because if you haven't ever read or listened to this James Baldwin, Jimmy, as I like to call him, or Margaret Mead conversation, A Rap on Race, it's deep. It's deep. I mean, it's obviously many years old, but it's just a beautiful cross-cultural, cross-gender conversation that just challenges. And so Baldwin makes this quote: what we call history is perhaps a way of avoiding responsibility for what is happening in our time, in our lifetime. And so I picked this quote because I have found so many people who like to think of racism as something in the past, right? We've come so far. And I'm not actually sure how far we've come. I think that that racism looks different than it did many years ago, many decades ago. But then in other ways, it looks really similar. And looking at some of the issues, this series really focuses on a post-George Floyd world. Looking at some of the images that we've seen over the last 18 months, things don't look that different. And so in this interview, Baldwin and Mead talk about who is responsible, and Mead asks, so Baldwin, Jimmy, are you responsible for the 4 little girls who died in the church bombing? And he said, I am. And she said, well, how could you possibly, as a Black man, be responsible for 4 little Black girls dying in a church in the South? And he said, I'm responsible because I didn't stop it. I didn't do enough. And we're all equally responsible in a world that is hideous and ugly, and other times really beautiful. And so I offer this quote for just your response, Kirby. What do you think? What are your thoughts that come up when you look at this quote?
So I thank you for sharing it. Also, thank you for providing the context around it and the conversation that these two folks were having that prompted it. There, it's one of these that you kind of get the feels from a little bit. You're going, oh yeah, whoa. And I think that inaction, right? The inaction, it's not just showing up and doing stuff, but where were the places that you didn't show up or you didn't step up? Because in those spaces, you are responsible. We are responsible, right? So to me, it kind of speaks to how even when no one's looking, we have a responsibility to speak up and out and take action. I think the quote itself, the way that he sort of frames this idea of if we can call it something that happened a long time ago or not right now, then it allows us to sort of distance ourselves and make it not a thing that we have to do, right? It's a oh yeah, no, that happened a long time ago, or that happened in a different place. So it's not really my responsibility. What I think he's saying here is that no, it is. It's all of our responsibility. It's our collective responsibility, because it's not something that's happening elsewhere or something that's happening in another time, but it's happening right now. And it requires all of us to care enough to do something about it. I appreciate this quote a lot. It has me thinking about how we show up and also what it feels like to avoid things, because sometimes we feel safer when we distance ourselves from things like, oh, that's not a thing I need to think about right now, right? You can sort of put some blinders on or blinkers on and avoid showing up. But he's telling us here that we can't do that, that's not acceptable. And even for himself, right? There's not an othering here. I really actually appreciate that about how he approaches this conversation. He's taking responsibility and using himself as a model to talk about why it's all of our responsibility. So yeah, those are the things that pop up for me. I don't know, how does that land for you, Dana, hearing my reflection?
Yeah, I love it. As I think about showing up, it makes me think of when I run workshops, right? These spaces where people come together once a month for 90 minutes to have really tender conversations. And in those spaces, even for organizations, this desire to lean on history, that past, we're doing some new work. Even as a country, this desire to rest the bad on history. People are so interested in making 9 a.m. this morning historical, right? Like, yes, that happened this morning. That's not now, right? And I struggle with that when I invite organizations to really push and think about what is actually happening now. Who are being silenced? How are people being dehumanized within your organization? What are the ways that you all have not acknowledged what has happened that is fairly recent? And I think for me as a Black woman, one of the areas that I get pushback from white people is this idea of bringing up old stuff. Like, oh, slavery, enslavement was so long ago. Why do we have to talk about that now? And those types of things. And the challenge is, when does history get to be defined? Like, what is the moment that becomes history? Is it like 10 minutes ago, that's history? When the hurt is still real. And so I think your point about not othering, how you show up, what are those missed opportunities, are really critical ones to reflect on. I don't know if this area of responsibility and history comes up in your work that you do.
It sure does. And as you were speaking, you prompted another thought and reflection that I had. There was a time not too long ago, maybe a couple years ago, when I was sitting at I'm not going to say where, but I was sitting at a graduation event, an undergraduate graduation event, and I was with some other folks that I didn't know very well, but I was connected to professionally, and I was with two other white women that were with me, And the keynote speaker was a Black man talking about his work in education and policy in, the Philadelphia area. And he started talking about slavery and the impacts, the lasting legacy of slavery, and how that impacts the educational systems in Philadelphia. And as I'm sitting there sort of, like leaning in, wanting to hear more. And he was a much older man at that point. He was reflecting on early in his career and then his own history in his life. And so he was a little bit difficult to hear. So I'm leaning in, really trying to capture every word. And one of these women that I was with, under her breath, but I heard it, right, was, yeah, but that was like however many hundreds of years ago. What the hell, get over it. And I just had this really strong reaction to that. And then I realized over time that my outrage at another white woman saying something like that, right, is part of the journey of me thinking about my own identity as a white woman, right? Because I wonder if there weren't parts of me in my own personal history where I may have thought the same thing, right? I don't know if I said it in that way, but like, whoa, Kirby, you can be outraged at that other white woman. That's a bad white woman, right? Like I can do this othering, but the reality is like, pump the brakes for a second and think about, where does that come from? And can you really look yourself in the mirror and say that you haven't at various points in your life had thoughts that were just as hurtful as that? And if you have, then what are you going to do about it? Right. So the idea of responsibility for me comes up when I think about that and pushing on history. Right. And what you said, if the hurt is still real, right. And of course, I'm wishing I had the eloquence and the wherewithal to have said that to her at that moment, but I didn't, right. I had the wherewithal to go like, what just happened? And then not say anything else. I also wish of myself that I had said something, right. So it just has me thinking about history and responsibility, collective history and individual history, because they interact, right. Those two things are constantly evolving and connecting. So yeah, that's what's coming up for me as I think about this quote and then your reflection on it.
Ooh-wee, thank you for that share. When I think about those moments of responsibility, I think in the first response you said how I haven't shown up and when I have. And one of the things that we do in our groups, in the workshops, is a cultural do-over. And this isn't necessarily for you, Kirby, but just for our audience, in those moments where we have misses, right? Where we wish we could have said something. And it's a heartbreak. You feel that hurt. You could easily, your brain, access that memory so fast, right? It wasn't like you're like, I'm trying to think.
Yeah, right. But it's right there, right?
You can remember all of that. It's really lived experience. And what I invite people to do is a cultural do-over, where you actually look in the mirror and redo that conversation and say those words, move your jaw. What do you wish you would have said? And doing that process of a cultural do-over actually creates the muscle memory that, you can be pretty sure that you're going to run into those moments again, right? Because we are all infected with racism, prejudice, and bias. So don't worry, racism going to give you another chance, right? And so doing that practice is going to prepare you in that next moment to know, okay, how would I handle it? And one of my favorite, lowest, easiest interventions to do in those types of moments where I don't have the energy, I don't have the capacity, maybe I don't have the courage, whatever the barrier is from the work of Dr. Sue, where he talks about a micro intervention of just a sound, where you basically, it's like an exaggerated clutching of one's pearls, like, and then just going to, and I love that as a micro intervention. So then the person's like, what did I say? And so they're left thinking about, pondering all of that. They're now going to possibly invite you in a dialogue. You get a little bit of time to think through it, or like, I don't even want to go into that with you. They said, and like practicing in those ways that don't have to be huge interventions, but can also have a major impact.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. That's good homework for me. You'll find me in my bathroom mirror later thinking about that and what, reflect on what would I have said or what would I have done differently in a moment like that.
Yeah, I find just the exaggerated response is the easiest for me. Like I always have fake imaginary day, like anything they do. I'm like, yes, thank you, Dr. Sue, for that resource.
That's a good one. I like it. Yeah.
I have the quotes are set up in order for mine first and then yours, but I want to bring yours in first. Is there a particular, I'm going to jump up. Here, is this a good one?
Yeah, this is a great, I mean, it's a great one. Yes. Thank you for giving me the chance to talk a little bit more about it. So this is a quote from a person who is involved in sort of bodily liberation, food sovereignty, health equity. That's sort of their area of passion and expertise. The pronouns they use are she, they, and their first name is Petrilli. I don't actually know their last name because this is from Instagram. I'm not a big social media person, but it's one that like really jumped out to me. This for me is, I'm going to read it. If you're going to be active in dismantling systemic oppression, get comfortable with the fact that you're going to be a villain in a few stories. And I put that one first for me because it helps me reflect on getting to a place where I can sit with the discomfort of knowing that I'm going to be a villain in a few stories, right? Like that there are places that my own history, my collective history, my identity have made it such that you know, we were the antagonists. We were the ones that created hurt in others, and I am the one that has created hurt in others. So that's been hard though to get to. I'll be really honest, right? Like it's not easy to get to a place where you're like, whoa, I've done things to hurt people, right? Intentionally, unintentionally, through my proximity to power and resources. And I put that in the beginning for me because it's part of like, I had to get to that spot where I sat with that and was like, oh man, crap, right? Like sit with that and get to the space where you can go, yeah, like, nope, then I can start to think about what to do with it. But if I can't get to the place where I recognize how I'm a villain in a few stories, then it's going to be hard to do this work authentically. So I put that one first because it really has me thinking about owning the same thing your quote talked about, responsibility, right? Really a responsibility. Yeah.
Oh, Kirby, this quote, I feel like I need to share it with my therapist and then like a month of series with just this quote. It's so deep, you know?
Yeah.
I think it's the piece that you talk about as, you know, a white woman navigating this work, right? Yeah. So when I read this, I think, oh yeah, white women might have to get comfortable with being a villain. Mm-hmm. And all of the reflections really resonate with when I think about my white brothers, sisters, and non-binary siblings. Mm-hmm. When I think about the body that I live in, the first part, the fact that someone has to say, if you're going to be active in dismantling systemic oppression, get comfortable with the fact that you're going to be a villain in a few stories, feels so privileged. Mm-hmm. I think the fact that I'm going to be villainized as a Black woman, no one ever had to tell me that, right? Like I'm already villainized. You know, right. I walked into the room as a 6 foot tall Black woman with dreadlocks, likely being at risk for being labeled as the angry Black woman. Right. So even if I'm not trying to dismantle systemic oppression, if I'm just trying to own my own experience and express it, I'm at risk for being villainized. So it's that piece of the privilege that someone even had to tell someone that. But then when I think about it on another level, it becomes the fear that I have had my whole life of being villainized and the ways that not just as a Black person, but as a woman specifically, that I've been taught to play nice, right? To express dissatisfaction in a nice, lovely little package. And so it's that piece. But then I also lean into this word comfortable. And so many times when I meet with different organizations and people who are trying to hire me for this consulting work, they say things like, you know, you really make people feel comfortable. Well, we want people to feel comfortable. We want people to feel safe. And I say, well, you have the wrong person because there's nothing comfortable about dismantling systems of racism, oppression, and bias that have resulted in the murder of thousands and thousands of people. And I dare think that more people have died from racism than cancer. So there's nothing that's going to be comfortable about that or safe. But then the last insight, like I said, I need to really process this with my whole therapist. The villain of the story is being comfortable with that might be the price. of
Mhm.
deciding that a system that has been in place won't exist anymore. When there is change, I think I'm the villain in my story when I exercise and I'm trying to get a six pack, right? Like my abs find that I'm the villain. Like when change happens, there is a villain because change isn't always where we want to go as people. The brain
Right.
doesn't like change. We like
Mm.
if we know all the things in development and how important habits are, and so there's always going to be a villain in change. And so this quote is just so rich. Thank you so much, Kirby. I don't know, thoughts on my reflection?
Well, thank you for sharing them. Not surprisingly, there were things that you shared that I hadn't thought, like that were not ones that I thought of, which is why we're having the conversation, because I get to hear how this lands for you. So thank you for that. I think the one that sticks out to me the most is the privilege of having the privilege connected to this, right? Like that, even having to say that if it's going to be part of you're going to be part in actively dismantling systemic oppression, then you have to get comfortable with it, right? And your point being, well, even if you're just living your life, right, from your lens, the world that you walk in and the body that you walk in is, no, it's not just if I'm doing that, it's just if I'm literally like living my life. That has me thinking a lot about sort of, yeah, what the world says we have to do, or the ways that we have to act, how that's different for you than it is for me, and the realities of that. And then what do we do about it, right? How do we push back against that, so that that's not the case? The part about comfortable also resonated. I can envision you having to say to organizations, like, if you want comfortable, this is probably not for you, right? And I think about that word comfortable a lot. Like, is that our goal, to be comfortable when we're having this? Not really, because really, change isn't comfortable. Like you said, the body and the brain, they don't want to change. We want to keep the status quo, homeostasis, right? That's how the whole bodily system works. But really, I don't know that being comfortable is the goal, because I don't know that that'll actually get us to where we want to go. I think being uncomfortable, and I don't know that this is a helpful rabbit hole to go down, but I'll just mention it here. The conversation that then comes out of this a lot for me is people asking about what's the difference between feeling uncomfortable and unsafe. Right? Like where is the sweet spot where you're where you're uncomfortable enough to challenge yourself, to think differently, to recognize that change has to happen, right? But then where is a space where it's unsafe? So I don't know, that it's just something that comes up, I think, when we talk about being comfortable and change.
Oh my goodness, I feel like you just took a seat in my brain. I've pondered that quite a bit, about comfort, safety, and then I've interjected the word capable. I think it really leans for me in working in military medicine. We're working with soldiers, going to military schools growing up, having a family that has served, as soldiers. And anyone that I know that has been deployed, safety does not interfere with getting the job done that needs to get done. This work is not always safe, especially when it's really happening, like when change is for real happening. There is going to be a question of resources. And so for me, as I navigate those three words of comfort and safety, I'm always looking for, how can you be capable? And so if you're unsafe because you're going to say some things about racism and then your boss is going to punish you, if you're going to say some things and your leadership and the board isn't going to like it, if you're going to say some things and a patient might curse you out, if you're going to say some things and a parent makes a complaint, you're not safe in some ways, but safety in what sense? But bigger than that is capable. So my goal is to help people recognize that sweet spot of being uncomfortable or having discomfort, questioning safety, but still being completely capable of engaging and doing the work.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I like that. That's a new lens for me, to add that. I like that a lot, though. Thank you. That'll there's
because everyone wants comfort and safety,
right?
That. All right, so I'm going to move us along. Let me select for me. This is out of order, but we could not be a Black woman and a white woman having this conversation without referencing the brilliant and amazing work of how white feminism portrays women of color. This book is brilliant. White Tears, Brown Scars. A lot of the dialogue that you've seen in the last 5 years, I dare say, was anchored in some of the work by Ham. And I just adore her book so much. And it has helped so much in my relationships with white women that I love. You know, I know some lovely racists. And so the quote specifically, I was like, which one should I pick for this book, for this talk? That even as we aggregate against the sexism of a male dominated society, because it is also a white dominated society, we are also, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the idea is this space that white women, and I saw this quote today, that both white women and Black men, as they navigate this between space of wanting to have the power of a white man, you know, of wanting to have the privileges that white masculinity brings or white maleness brings, they are also at risk of becoming the oppressor. So both the Black man is at risk, or the man of color, and also the white woman being adjacent, being so close, being so intimate to white maleness by fatherhood, through intimate relationships, through your brother, like all of these different ways that white women have access to white maleness that is very different than women of color specific in general, but Black women more specifically. And so thinking about navigating white women's spaces, how does this quote bring out, or how do you respond to this quote, Kirby?
Yeah, it's a really, it's a powerful one. Thank you for sharing it. It has me thinking again, Dana, about proximity to power and what that means and why that's relevant. It also has me thinking about sort of my identity and that vacillation between oppressor and oppressed, right? And what that means. I also, you know, the first time I heard the term white lady tears or white woman tears, it was a while ago now, but I remember thinking like, huh? I don't get it. Like, what does that mean? And then I read some more, and then I was in a situation where I probably had just enough awareness to recognize something, but not enough to like really deeply understand. And I saw a situation happen. I was like, oh my gosh, that's right. And then I thought, when do I do that? When have I done that? When does the centering, really, to me, this is about the centering for myself. When does the centering of my own experience come at the cost of someone else's, right? Because there's like you know, this sort of dualism between I have access to power because I'm proximal to white men because I'm white, but then I have access to an identity of someone who's been a victim because I'm a woman, and women aren't afforded the same privileges as men. But that dualism is a really interesting and dynamic spot to be in. I guess it also makes me think of like, well, how do I unify then, right? Like internally, personally, like how do I find a place where I can own both parts of myself and do so in a way that is healing for me and the people that I'm in relationships with and other people, right? I don't know. Those are the things that come up for me around this like dualism. That last line in this really like is there's a lot there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that question, like, how do I bring connection? How do I unite?
Mm-hmm.
How do I center all of the ways that people are marginalized and minoritized and honor that, but then also honor within the journey of being a woman, right? There is shared identity. It's a Venn diagram of sorts. It's not just one thing. I dare say that the only place of liberation in this is the work of Kimberly Crenshaw and her associates of intersectionality. You know, we have to always be holding that space of intersectionality. And I think it really, to me, speaks to how critical it is that we have psychological flexibility, right? That the more we're able to be flexible in our thinking and our reflection and our sharing and our listening, the better chance we have in really dismantling this.
Mhm.
And I see Fanny coming on and she's like, y'all conversation is almost up. We have 7 minutes. How did the time go? We have like 6 other quotes each for all of you. So we're going to open it up for some questions. I will answer the Q&A for the reference that I shared. It is Daryl W. Sue, Daryl Wing Sue. He wrote the article, just Google micro interventions circa American psychologist, January 2019.
Something like that, yeah.
2019 or 2018 in the American Psychologist. It's in the public domain, the full article. It's brilliant. He gives like lots of references. All right, Q&A.
Can you hear me? I'm unmuted.
Yep.
The only thing that I wanted to make sure that we were responding to some of the comments that was also in the chat box that wasn't in the Q&A box. And there was a question here, how can I be healing? Is a key question that someone asked, I guess, in light of all of this, and remain whole myself. How can I be healing and remain whole for myself? And I just thought, because of the limited amount of time, that might take a little bit of time to talk about that.
It's a great question. Dana, do you want to take a stab? Do you want me to?
Yeah, so this question, how can I'm guessing they mean like, how can I be a healer? Like in that sense?
Well, it could be, but I'm taking from it that the healing for themselves in the space, how can, and still maintain, and the person can feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question out if I'm not saying it right. I think I am, because they said yes.
So I think in the sense of being healing,
Yes, healing, self-healing.
Self-healing. So, it's a really interesting one, because I would start by saying it depends on the body that you live in, because you have different risk factors for how that body might hurt. So we all have work to do, but it's not the same work. So for instance, for me as a Black woman in predominantly white spaces, I am often called to speak on behalf of all the Black people on the whole planet, right? And so the things that I need to do for healing is to push back when I'm invited to caretake. When I don't have the ability to caretake. The things that I need to do is get really good at saying no and recognizing when I can say no versus when I have to say yes because some of my resources are at risk. So I have to have some discernment in that area. I also need to make sure that I have a clear understanding of trustworthiness. So in the sense of being able to look at systems, at individuals, at relationships to say, can I trust? What am I looking for in this relationship to make sure that the resources that I do have are worthy of me sharing here? And I would dare say one of the biggest things that BIPOC people can do for healing is to find a way to not engage in code switching behaviors where that we are who we are become performances for safety. And so learning when you have to do that, when you don't, how to do that, rather than the habit that many of us have been socialized to engage in. So I'll speak on the behalf in that space for BIPOC spaces. I'm not sure, Kirby, if you want to engage it from a different angle.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's being a healer involves looking inside and taking responsibility, right? So, I mean, because to me, healing is also about authenticity, right? So it means being real. It means being honest with yourself. So for me, part of my healing journey in this space as, in embracing and understanding the identity of what it means to be an oppressor is understanding that, right? I have to understand my own history around that and my own identity around that and really get real with myself about what that means. Oftentimes that means I have to spend time with other white folks talking about the ways in which we came to be in these spaces and what we have to do. I have to be aware of not bringing my identity into spaces where me talking about my own shame or my own guilt that I'm wrangling with or wrestling with, not bringing that into spaces where actually doing so is harmful to others, right? So I think the healing it's a complex process, but it involves not just looking at yourself relative to the outside and others around you, but also doing some hard work internally. Dana and I both are psychologists, so we obviously deeply believe in the power of good therapy, but like for me, this is part of that process. Like there's some deep self-work that has to happen. Yeah.
I love that, Kirby. Thank you.
I thank you both. I have another question. Boy, this time, where did it go? This was so fabulous. For those of you, anyone who might be checking out early, just hang on for 1 minute. I just also want to mention that these two amazing people will also have a fireside chat at our conference coming up November 9th. And who will be joining them will be Dr. Walter Gillian from Yale, who will be talking about expulsion suspension. And we have a very diverse panel of speakers who will be talking about trauma. So I just wanted to plug that before anyone left. But here's another question. I think it's our last question because of time. What is your opinion on the saying, preference isn't prejudice?
For the lack of time, I'll just be really succinct in that racism defends itself, bias also defends itself. It is, we live in a society now that overt racism, overt prejudice and bias are not really in polite company acceptable, right? And so when we get in this war of words, often I find that people haven't really done that work of dissecting, exploring, even asking the question, how did I develop this preference? Why do I have this preference? We all know in neuroscience research that part of the reason that advertisement works is that it conditions the brain to have a preference. So to me, unless someone is sitting on a mountaintop and dismantling and ripping out the racism and the prejudice and the bias within them and engaging in tender conversations and then meditating and then drinking some water and doing some sit-ups and then doing some more anti-racism work, I don't even know the person who can even get in a space where they can talk about the question of privilege versus prejudice. That's the really short answer of it.
Thank you. You have anything to add to that, Kirby?
I mean,
Wycoff?
Dana just said it so beautifully. I don't know, and it's 1 o'clock on the dot, and she cut right to the chase, and I'm right where she is on this one. Yeah.
Okay, listen, thank you two so very, very much. I am so glad that we're going to get you again, November 18th, November 9th. Oh my goodness, this is fabulous. And for all of you who chose to spend this time with us, we knew you could have spent this time anyplace else, but you chose to spend it with us. And for that, we are so grateful. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you November 9th and November 18th. November 18th is part 3 of this amazing series, and November 9th is our Equity and Inclusion Conference. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Dana.